My sister-in-law squatted in my inherited beach, changed the locks, and claimed tenant rights. I made sure she found her place. Rock bottom. I inherited a beach house from my grandmother 5 years ago. A small 2-bedroom place about 3 hours from where my husband Paul and I live. We'd go there maybe once a month in summer. Rent it out occasionally to cover maintenance costs. Nothing fancy, but it was paid off and perfect for weekend getaways. Paul's sister Diane had been complaining for years about how unfair it was that I inherited property when she was living in a cramped apartment with her 2 kids after her divorce. She'd hint constantly about how we should let her use the beach house since we barely went there anyway. I'd always change the subject because Diane had a history of destroying things. She'd borrowed Paul's car once and returned it with mysterious stains and a broken side mirror she claimed was already there. She'd house sat for their parents and they came back to find she'd painted their living room black without asking. So no, she wasn't getting keys to my beach house. Last March, Diane called Paul crying about getting laid off from her receptionist job and being behind on rent. Paul wanted to help, but I reminded him about the last 3 times we'd lent her money that never got paid back. We compromised by saying she could stay at the beach house for 2 weeks while she figured things out. Just 2 weeks. I gave her the spare key and the property manager's number in case anything went wrong. 2 weeks turned into a month. Every time we tried to visit, Diane had some emergency. Her kid was sick, she had a job interview, she was just about to leave but needed 1 more day. After 6 weeks, I told her she had to be out by the weekend because we had renters coming. She said okay. The renters called that Saturday saying someone was in the house refusing to leave. Diane had told them there was a misunderstanding and they couldn't stay there. I called Diane immediately and she said she'd decided to live there permanently since we weren't using it. She actually said she'd done research, and after living somewhere for 30 days, she had tenant rights, and we'd have to formally evict her if we wanted her out. She said she'd fight it in court and that could take months. I drove there that night with Paul. Diane had changed the locks. We could see through the windows she'd moved all her furniture in, had mail delivered there, even put up curtains. Her kids' toys were all over the yard. When we knocked, she called the police saying her landlords were harassing her. The cops showed up and Diane showed them utility bills in her name at that address. She'd actually transferred the electricity and water to her name without my permission. The officers said it was a civil matter and we'd need to go through the courts. Diane stood there smirking while they told us we couldn't enter our own property. She'd even registered her kids for school using the beach house address. She said we had 2 houses and she had none, so this was only fair. What Diane didn't know was that I'd hired a property management company years ago to handle the rentals and maintenance. They had their own set of keys, legal authority to manage the property, and most importantly, they'd been tracking everything. The property manager Tom called me the next day. He'd noticed unusual utility usage and had already started documenting Diane's unauthorized occupancy. He'd taken photos of her moving in, had records of her never signing any rental agreement, and had been building a case since week 3 when he'd gotten suspicious. Tom had also discovered something interesting. Diane had filed for emergency housing assistance using the beach house address, claiming she'd been paying rent to me for 6 months. She'd forged rental receipts and submitted them to the county for aid. Tom had already contacted the housing authority about the discrepancy when they'd called to verify her tenancy. He told them she was not, and had never been a legal tenant. The housing authority investigator came out that week. Diane tried to show them her fake receipts, but Tom had real documentation showing the property's rental history, every legitimate tenant with signed agreements, proof that Diane had never paid a cent. The investigator also found that Diane was still collecting unemployment while working under the table at a bar in town, another fraud issue. Within 3 days, Diane was arrested for welfare fraud, identity theft for changing the utilities without authorization, and filing false documents. While she was being processed, Tom had his maintenance crew come in and change all the locks back. We removed all her belongings and put them in storage, sending her the location and giving her 30 days to collect them. Diane tried to come back after posting bail, but her key didn't work anymore. She stood on the lawn screaming that we'd illegally evicted her. The cops finally drove away and Diane stormed to her car, still yelling about how we'd stolen her home. Her face was red and twisted with rage as she yanked open the driver's door. I stood on the lawn shaking, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. Tom called before Diane even pulled out of the driveway. He confirmed the locks were changed and all her stuff was in Unit 247 at Coastal Storage on Beach Road. I saved the address in my phone while watching Diane's taillights disappear down the street. My whole body felt like it was vibrating with leftover anger and this weird relief that made me want to cry. I texted Diane the storage information as soon as I got back to my car. I kept it simple, just the address and unit number, then added that state law gave her 30 days to collect everything before the facility could auction it. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe 3 seconds before I pressed it. Her response came back in under a minute. A wall of curse words and threats about suing me for everything I owned, taking the house back, making sure everyone knew what a terrible person I was. I stared at the screen feeling sick and angry at the same time. Tom called again while I was reading her texts and told me not to worry. He said all her threats were empty given the criminal charges she was facing. The welfare fraud alone carried serious penalties, and the identity theft for changing utilities without permission made it worse. Paul and I got in the car to drive home, and neither of us said a word. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. I could see his jaw clenching and unclenching like he was chewing on everything he wanted to say but couldn't. The silence felt heavy and awful. We'd been married 8 years, and I couldn't remember ever feeling this kind of tension between us. 3 hours of driving through the dark with nothing but the sound of tires on asphalt and our own breathing. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Paul went straight to his office without looking at me. I heard him shut the door, and then his voice came through, tight and defensive. He was talking to his mom, Jacqueline. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew that tone. He was trying to explain what happened, trying to justify why we'd done what we did. An hour later, my phone rang with Jacqueline's number. I almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding her would just make things worse. She was crying before I even said hello. She begged me to drop the charges against Diane. Her voice was shaky and desperate as she kept saying Diane was just in a bad place. She'd made mistakes, but she was trying her best. I felt my jaw tighten as I listened to her make excuses. When she finally stopped talking, I told her that welfare fraud wasn't a mistake. Identity theft wasn't a mistake. Those were crimes that Diane chose to commit. Jacqueline started crying harder and said I was being cruel, that Diane had nowhere to go now. I reminded her that Diane had an apartment before she decided to squat in my house. She'd had options, and she'd chosen to break the law instead. Jacqueline hung up on me, and I sat there staring at my phone feeling like the worst person alive, even though I knew I was right. The next morning, Diane's public defender called my cell at 8:30. His name was Philip McCoy, and he had this smooth voice like he was trying to sell me something. He wanted to meet and discuss what he kept calling a family misunderstanding. He said we could resolve everything without further legal action if we just sat down and talked it through. I told him to hold on and called Andre Langley, my attorney, on three-way. Andre's voice cut through Philip's smooth talk like a knife. He shut down every suggestion that I should drop charges or let Diane avoid what was coming. Philip tried to paint it as a family matter that got out of hand, but Andre wasn't having it. He laid out exactly what Diane had done: the forged documents, the fraud, the systematic lies. Philip's voice got quieter as Andre talked, and by the end of the call, he said he'd be in touch and hung up fast. Andre called me back right after to explain something important. Even if I wanted to drop charges, which I didn't, the welfare fraud case belonged to the state now. Diane had defrauded government programs, and the county prosecutor, Michaela Berry, was the one handling it. Andre said Berry had a reputation for going hard on fraud cases, especially when someone was collecting benefits while working under the table. He told me Berry had zero interest in plea deals for people who systematically stole from taxpayers. The case was moving forward whether I participated or not, though my testimony would help. I felt this strange mix of relief and guilt, knowing it was out of my hands now. Paul's phone started ringing that afternoon and didn't stop. His sister, his cousins, his aunt, his uncle, all calling to tell him he was letting his wife destroy Diane's life. I could hear him trying to explain through the wall, his voice getting louder and more frustrated with each call. Finally, he just turned his phone completely off and came to find me in the kitchen. He put his arms around me and said he supported me completely, that I'd done the right thing. But I could see it in his eyes, that guilt eating away at him. His sister was facing jail time, and his whole family blamed him for not stopping me. He held me tight, and I held him back, but we both knew this was going to get worse before it got better. 3 days after the arrest, Diane made bail. Jacqueline and Paul's dad had scraped together the money somehow. Within an hour of getting out, Diane was on social media posting about how I'd stolen her home. She wrote this long thing about being a struggling single mom just trying to survive, about how her evil sister-in-law had her arrested for trying to keep a roof over her kids' heads. She made it sound like I'd kicked a homeless woman and her children onto the street for no reason. Paul's extended family started commenting and taking sides. Some defended Diane, others stayed quiet. A few actually said she'd brought it on herself. I watched the comments multiply and felt sick. Our private family mess was now public entertainment. Paul's uncle left me a voicemail that same day. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail and listened after. His voice was mean and sharp as he called me a heartless bitch who was putting 2 innocent kids on the street. He said I should be ashamed of myself, that I had 2 houses and couldn't spare one for family in need. He went on for almost 2 minutes about how I was destroying the family and how Paul should have married someone with compassion. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Andre. He told me to keep any evidence of harassment because if this got worse, we might need restraining orders. The idea that it could get even worse than this made my stomach hurt. Tom emailed me photos later that week showing the inside of the beach house after Diane left. She'd painted 2 walls this dark purple color without asking, just went ahead and did it like the house was hers. The bathroom mirror was smashed, big cracks spreading across it like a spider web. Trash was piled in corners, old food containers and kids' toys scattered everywhere. Tom had hired a professional cleaning crew and sent me the bill. $800 to get the place back to rentable condition. I stared at the photos, feeling this cold anger settle in my chest. She'd treated my grandmother's house like garbage, damaged it on purpose maybe, and now expected sympathy for facing consequences. Andre sent a formal invoice to Diane's public defender 3 days after we got the beach house back. The bill listed everything with dates and receipts attached. Unauthorized painting of 2 walls, $400 to restore. Broken bathroom mirror, $120 replacement. Professional cleaning after she left trash everywhere, $800. Lost rental income for the 6 weeks she squatted when we had legitimate bookings, $2,000. Legal fees for Andre's time dealing with this mess, $3,000. The total came to $6,400, and I knew Diane couldn't pay it. She could barely make rent before losing her job. But Andre said we needed the paper trail, needed everything documented in case this went to civil court later. He sent it certified mail so there'd be proof she received it. Michaela Berry's office called me the following week. The prosecutor wanted a formal interview about the timeline and Diane's fake rental receipts. I drove to the county courthouse with Tom and brought 3 folders of documentation. Tom had printed everything: rental agreements from the past 5 years showing every legitimate tenant, payment records, maintenance logs, photos of the property before and after each rental. He'd even pulled utility records showing normal usage patterns versus the spike when Diane moved in. I sat across from Michaela in her small office with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and went through it all. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, asked specific questions about dates and amounts. I showed her the emails where Diane kept making excuses about leaving, the texts where she finally admitted she planned to stay permanently. Tom pulled out the forged receipts Diane had submitted to the housing authority, side by side with real receipts from actual tenants. The forgeries were obvious once you knew what to look for. Wrong font, wrong format, amounts that didn't match any legitimate rental periods. Michaela leaned back in her chair and told me something I didn't know. Diane had collected $3,200 in emergency housing assistance based on those fake receipts. She'd told the county she was paying me $900 a month for 6 months, showed them her forged proof, and they'd given her money meant for people actually struggling with rent. Plus, she'd been collecting unemployment the whole time while working at Murphy's bar for cash under the table. The bartender there had already confirmed it to investigators. Diane was getting paid $200 a week in cash, no taxes, no records, while telling the state she couldn't find work. Michaela said the fraud charges were way more serious than I'd realized. This wasn't just about squatting in my beach house. Diane had systematically stolen from government programs designed to help people in real need. Paul and I had our first real fight that night. We'd been home maybe 20 minutes when he brought it up. He was standing in the kitchen making coffee and asked if maybe we could help Diane pay back the housing assistance to reduce her charges. I was loading the dishwasher and my hands froze on a plate. I asked him if he was serious right now. He said she's still his sister and the kids didn't deserve to see their mom go to jail. I slammed the dishwasher shut and lost it. I reminded him about every single time she'd used us. The $3,000 we lent her 2 years ago that never came back. The car she borrowed and returned destroyed. The times she'd promised to change and never did. I told him she'd committed actual crimes, multiple felonies, and stolen from programs meant for people who really needed help. He stood there with the coffee pot in his hand, looking miserable. Finally, he admitted he knew I was right, but watching his sister destroy herself was killing him. We didn't talk much the rest of the night. Jacqueline showed up at our house 3 days later without calling first. I opened the door, and she was standing there in her church clothes looking like she'd been crying. She asked if she could come in. I let her because what else was I supposed to do? She sat on our couch twisting a tissue in her hands and begged me to talk to the prosecutor about a plea deal that would keep Diane out of jail. She kept saying, "What about the kids? What about Marilyn and Luke? They need their mother." I stayed standing because sitting felt too much like this was a normal visit. I told her Diane should have thought about her kids before committing multiple felonies. Jacqueline started crying harder and said I was being cruel. That family helps family. I said family doesn't steal from family and expect everyone to just accept it. She left still crying and Paul watched from the hallway but didn't try to stop either of us. The housing authority investigator contacted me 2 weeks later about testifying at Diane's preliminary hearing. They needed me to explain the timeline and show proof she was never my tenant. I agreed immediately because I wanted every bit of this documented in official court records. The hearing was set for the following month. Andre walked me through what to expect, what questions they'd ask, how to present the evidence clearly. He said Diane's attorney would try to make me look vindictive, but the facts were on our side. The preliminary hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in late June. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and uncomfortable chairs. Diane sat at the defense table with her public defender and glared at me the entire time. I took the witness stand and the prosecutor asked me to explain how Diane came to be at the beach house. I went through the whole timeline, the 2-week agreement, her refusal to leave, the changed locks, finding out about the fake receipts. I showed the court Tom's documentation, the real rental history, proof that Diane never paid me anything. Her attorney stood up and tried to paint me as vindictive, asked if I'd ever offered to help Diane with housing, suggested I was punishing her for being poor. I said no, I was protecting my property from someone who committed fraud. The judge looked bored with the defense attorney's questions. The judge found enough evidence to proceed with all charges and set a trial date for 2 months out. Diane started crying at the defense table. I looked over and saw Marilyn and Luke sitting in the back row. Marilyn was 16 and trying to look tough, but her eyes were red. Luke was only 12 and looked confused about what was happening. They were watching their mom fall apart in a courtroom, and I felt sick about it even though I knew she'd brought this completely on herself. Paul reached over and squeezed my hand as we left. Paul's family stopped inviting us to gatherings after that. His aunt was having a birthday party the next weekend, and usually we'd get a call about it. Nothing. His cousin was doing a cookout for the 4th of July, and we found out about it from someone's Facebook post. Paul tried calling his mom to ask what was going on, and she said my presence caused drama. What she really meant was they didn't want to face the fact that Diane committed crimes, and I was the one who'd reported her. Paul was hurt but stood by me. I could see it though, how much he missed his family, how much this was costing him even though he never said I should have handled things differently. Diane's attorney contacted Andre 2 weeks before the trial date with a plea offer. Diane would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation and paying back the money. Andre called me to discuss it and said we should seriously consider accepting. A trial would be emotionally exhausting and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Juries could be unpredictable, and Diane's attorney would play up the single mom angle hard. Andre said a guaranteed guilty plea with restitution might be the smartest move even if it felt like letting her off easy. I called Michaela's office the next morning and set up a meeting for that afternoon at the county building. The prosecutor's office was on the 3rd floor, one of those government spaces with beige walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look tired. Michaela met me in a small conference room with a stack of folders on the table between us. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with her hair pulled back tight and reading glasses perched on her nose. She opened the top folder and showed me photos of Diane's fake receipts, the ones she'd submitted to the housing authority claiming she'd paid me rent for 6 months. Michaela said the fraud was really calculated, not just a desperate mistake. Diane had researched what documents she needed, created fake letterhead with my name on it, forged my signature multiple times, and submitted everything with dates that lined up perfectly with her story. She'd even made up fake check numbers to make it look more real. Michaela said someone who goes to that much trouble isn't just confused or overwhelmed. They're intentionally stealing. But then Michaela leaned back in her chair and said trials were expensive and risky. The county would have to pay for expert witnesses to testify about the forged documents, bring in the housing authority investigators, possibly call character witnesses. It could take 2 full days in court, maybe more. And juries were unpredictable, especially when the defendant was a single mom with 2 kids. Diane's attorney would absolutely play that angle hard, show photos of Marilyn and Luke, talk about how desperate she was after losing her job. Michaela said she'd prosecuted fraud cases before where juries let people off because they felt sorry for them, even with solid evidence. A guaranteed guilty plea with restitution meant Diane would have a fraud conviction on her record forever. She'd have to pay back every cent, and she'd be on probation for 3 years. Any violation, and she'd go straight to jail. Michaela said sometimes the smart move was taking the win you could guarantee instead of gambling on a jury. Andre called me that evening after Michaela sent over the official plea offer. The terms were laid out in a 4-page document that Andre read through twice before explaining it to me. Diane would plead guilty to 1 count of welfare fraud and 1 count of filing false documents. The other charges, including the identity theft for changing the utilities, would be dropped as part of the deal. She'd have to pay back the full $3,200 in housing assistance she'd fraudulently received, plus penalties and court costs that brought the total to around $4,800. 200 hours of community service had to be completed within 18 months. 3 years of probation with monthly check-ins and random home visits from her probation officer. If she violated any terms, missed payments, failed to show up for community service, or got arrested for anything else, the judge could revoke the plea and sentence her to up to 2 years in county jail. No jail time if she followed every single rule for 3 full years. Andre said it was actually a tough deal considering she'd be under the court's thumb for that long, but it avoided the risk and expense of trial. I met with Andre again 2 days later at his office to officially accept the plea deal. He had me sign paperwork agreeing to the terms and confirming I understood that Diane wouldn't serve jail time unless she violated probation. I asked him if a fraud conviction would really follow her around like he'd said before. Andre pulled up his computer and showed me how background checks worked. Any employer, landlord, or bank that ran a criminal background check would see 2 fraud convictions on her record. She'd have to check the box on job applications, asking if she'd ever been convicted of a crime. Most apartment complexes would reject her application automatically. She'd have trouble getting credit cards or loans. Andre said fraud convictions were particularly bad because they showed dishonesty, and made people not trust you with money or property. It wasn't as serious as violent crime, but it would make her life harder for years. I signed the papers. Paul was relieved when I told him that night. He'd been stressed about the idea of sitting through a trial, having his whole family there watching, Diane's attorney making me look bad on the witness stand. He was worried about his mom and how she'd react to the plea deal, but he said at least it was over. I told him it wasn't really over until Diane finished 3 years of probation, but he just wanted to believe the worst part was behind us. The plea hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning. Paul and I drove to the courthouse together, neither of us talking much on the way. The courtroom was the same one from the preliminary hearing, wood paneling and uncomfortable chairs, and that weird smell courtrooms have. Diane sat at the defense table with her public defender, wearing a dark blue dress that looked borrowed and flats instead of her usual heels. She didn't look at me when we came in. Michaela was already there shuffling through papers at the prosecutor's table. The judge came in and everyone stood up, then sat back down when he told us to. The judge asked Diane to stand and state her full name for the record. She stood up slowly and said her name so quietly the judge had to ask her to repeat it louder. Then he went through the charges one by one, asking if she understood what she was pleading guilty to. For the welfare fraud charge, he made her admit out loud that she'd filed false documents claiming she'd paid rent when she hadn't, that she'd received $3,200 in government assistance she wasn't entitled to, and that she'd done this knowingly and intentionally. Diane's voice shook when she said yes. For the filing false documents charge, the judge made her admit she'd forged receipts with my name and signature, that she'd created fake rental payment records, and that she'd submitted these to a government agency knowing they were false. Diane started crying halfway through, but the judge didn't stop. He asked if anyone had forced her to do these things or threatened her. She said no. He asked if she understood she was giving up her right to a trial. She said yes. He asked if she understood the penalties and probation terms. She said yes again. Watching her stand there, forced to admit everything she'd done, felt better than I expected. She couldn't smirk or make excuses or play victim. She had to take responsibility for every single lie. The judge accepted her guilty plea and moved on to sentencing. He didn't just announce the terms, though. He leaned forward and looked directly at Diane and started talking about how she'd exploited a family relationship to commit fraud. He said she'd taken advantage of her sister-in-law's generosity by turning a 2-week favor into an illegal occupation. He said she'd stolen from taxpayers by fraudulently claiming housing assistance meant for people in genuine need. He said she'd taught her children that lying and manipulating were acceptable when you wanted something. His voice got harder when he talked about the forged documents and how much planning had gone into her fraud. This wasn't a desperate mistake, he said. This was calculated theft. Diane kept her eyes on the floor the whole time, her shoulders hunched. When she mumbled an apology, it sounded completely fake, like she was reading lines someone told her to say. The judge sentenced her to the terms in the plea agreement and told her that if she violated probation even once, she'd serve the maximum jail time. Then he dismissed her and moved on to the next case like she didn't matter anymore. Outside the courtroom, Diane's attorney approached Andre while we were waiting for the elevator. He said Diane wanted to apologize to me personally as part of taking responsibility for what she'd done. Andre looked at me and I shook my head immediately. I told Andre absolutely not. I didn't want to hear anything from Diane, and any communication needed to go through lawyers. Her attorney tried to say it would help with her rehabilitation or something, but Andre shut him down. He said his client had made her position clear, and Diane needed to respect that boundary. We got in the elevator and left. Paul squeezed my hand but didn't say anything. I felt relieved and exhausted and still angry all at the same time. Paul's mom sent him a long email that night. He read it on his phone at dinner and his face went red. He handed me the phone without saying anything. Jacqueline had written 3 paragraphs about how disappointed she was in both of us for not showing compassion and forgiveness to family. She said Diane had made mistakes, but she was still Paul's sister and the mother of his niece and nephew. She said we were being cruel and vindictive by pushing for criminal charges instead of handling this privately within the family. She said she'd raised Paul to be more caring than this, and she didn't recognize the person he'd become. Paul took his phone back and started typing a response immediately. He wrote that compassion didn't mean enabling criminal behavior and letting someone face no consequences for fraud. He said he loved his sister, but she'd committed serious crimes that hurt multiple people, including me. He said he was proud of me for standing up for myself instead of letting Diane walk all over us like she'd done to everyone else in the family. He said if being caring meant letting Diane destroy property and steal money without consequences, then he was fine being the person his mom didn't recognize. He sent it before I could read the whole thing. 2 weeks passed and I got a certified letter from the storage facility where we'd moved Diane's belongings. The letter said the 30-day deadline for her to collect her stuff was in 3 days, and if she didn't show up, they'd auction everything per their policy. I called Tom immediately and asked him to go photograph everything in the unit before the deadline. He drove over that afternoon and sent me pictures of furniture, boxes of clothes, kids' toys, kitchen stuff, all of it sitting in a 10 by 10 storage unit. He took photos of the notice taped to the unit door showing the deadline date. He photographed the lock and the unit number and got a written statement from the facility manager confirming when the deadline was and what would happen if Diane didn't collect her things. I saved everything in a folder on my computer. Day 31 came and Diane still hadn't picked up her stuff. The storage facility called me since I was the one who'd rented the unit and paid the first month. They said they'd be auctioning the contents that weekend per state law. I said okay, and asked them to send me documentation of the auction. I felt guilty thinking about Marilyn and Luke losing their toys and clothes and whatever else was in there. Those kids didn't do anything wrong. But Andre had told me multiple times that I'd followed the law exactly, given proper notice, paid for storage, and it wasn't my fault if Diane chose not to collect her belongings. I'd done more than I was legally required to do. The guilt still sat in my stomach, though. The auction happened on Saturday morning. I got an email Monday with the results. Someone had bought the entire unit contents for $340. Everything Diane owned was gone. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize at first. It was Diane saying I'd stolen her children's belongings, and she was reporting me to the police for theft. She said I'd had no right to auction off their stuff and she was going to make sure I got arrested. I forwarded the text to Andre without responding. He called me an hour later and said he'd already contacted Diane's attorney. He'd sent copies of the storage facility notice, the certified letter, Tom's photographs, and the auction documentation. He'd informed her attorney that Diane had been given proper legal notice and 30 days to collect her belongings, and her failure to act wasn't my responsibility. He said if Diane contacted me again directly instead of going through lawyers, we'd file for a restraining order. I didn't hear anything else from her after that. Paul suggested we take a weekend at the beach house, our first visit since getting it back. I felt weird about going there after everything that had happened, but he said we needed to reclaim the space and make it ours again. We drove down on a Friday afternoon, and when I unlocked the door, my stomach clenched up. But walking through the rooms, I realized Tom's crew had done incredible work. Everything was clean and fixed and smelled like fresh paint instead of Diane's cheap perfume. The curtains she'd hung were gone, replaced with the ones I'd picked out years ago that Tom had stored away. Her kids' crayon marks had been scrubbed off the walls. It looked like our beach house again, not some crime scene. Paul walked through every room, touching the walls and furniture like he was making sure it was real. He kept saying how good everything looked, how you'd never know what had happened here. We spent that first night just sitting on the deck watching the ocean, not talking much, both of us processing that this place was actually ours again. Saturday morning, we went to the hardware store and bought paint for the 2 walls Diane had ruined with her unauthorized decorating. She'd painted them this awful dark purple color that made the whole living room feel like a cave. Paul and I spent the day rolling fresh white paint over every trace of her bad choices. We replaced the bathroom mirror she'd broken. The one she'd claimed was already cracked when she moved in, even though I had photos proving otherwise. The physical work felt good, like we were erasing her presence one brushstroke at a time. Paul seemed lighter as the day went on, laughing at my terrible painting technique and getting paint in his hair. He told me he was glad we'd stood our ground even though it cost us relationships with most of his family. He said he'd been worried about losing me if he'd chosen his sister over what was right. I told him that would never happen, but I was grateful he'd picked our marriage over family pressure. We finished painting by sunset and stood back looking at the clean white walls. Paul put his arm around me and said, "This felt like a fresh start, like we were taking back what was stolen." Monday afternoon, I checked my email and found a message from Jacqueline asking if we could meet for coffee to clear the air. I stared at the screen for a long time trying to decide if I wanted to open that door again. Paul walked past and saw me reading it. He leaned over my shoulder and told me his mom had been calling him a lot lately, sounding different from before, less defensive about Diane. He said she'd been dealing with Diane living at her house and it was apparently a disaster. He thought maybe his mom was finally ready to admit that Diane had real problems instead of just blaming everyone else. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear her out after she'd pressured me so hard to drop charges, but Paul encouraged me to give her one chance. He said his mom had enabled Diane for decades, but maybe hitting rock bottom was changing her perspective. I sent back a short reply saying I'd meet her for coffee on Thursday at a place near our house. Thursday came and I almost backed out 3 times before actually going. Jacqueline was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in, looking older than I remembered. She stood up and hugged me, which surprised me because she'd barely spoken to me since the arrest. We sat down and she started talking immediately, like she'd been rehearsing this. She said Diane had always been difficult, even as a kid, always feeling like the world owed her something. She admitted she'd bailed Diane out of problems her whole life, paid her rent, covered her debts, made excuses for her behavior. She apologized for pressuring me to drop the charges and said she understood now why I couldn't let it go. She said watching Diane face actual consequences was hard, but necessary. She told me she was proud of me for standing firm when the whole family was attacking me. I didn't know what to say at first because I'd expected her to still be defending Diane or asking me to help somehow. but she seemed genuinely sorry and genuinely exhausted by her daughter's behavior. Jacqueline started telling me about Diane living with her, and it sounded like absolute chaos. Diane refused to follow basic house rules, left messes everywhere, wouldn't look for legitimate work because she said no one would hire her with a criminal record. Jacqueline said Diane spent most days on her phone complaining on social media about how unfair her life was instead of doing anything to fix it. She said Diane had missed 3 job interviews Jacqueline had set up for her through friends. The kids were struggling because Diane kept pulling them out of activities she couldn't afford and blaming everyone else for their problems. Jacqueline said she was starting to realize that protecting Diane from consequences all these years had just made everything worse. She said she should have let Diane fail a long time ago instead of always swooping in to save her. She asked if Paul and I would consider having dinner with her sometime, just the 3 of us, because she missed her son and missed having me in the family. I told her I'd think about it, and we left it at that. Over the next few months, Paul and I started going back to the beach house regularly like we used to, usually 1 weekend a month. Each visit felt a little more normal, a little less haunted by what had happened. We'd walk on the beach and work on small projects around the house, and it started feeling like ours again instead of some battleground we'd had to fight for. We talked about renting it out more often through Tom's company to build up our savings. Paul mentioned maybe doing some renovations to increase the rental value. It felt good making plans for the property instead of just defending it from his sister. 3 months after the plea deal, I got an envelope from the county probation office. Inside was a notice that Diane had violated her probation by missing her required community service hours and failing to make any restitution payments. Her probation officer had filed a violation report with the court, and there would be a hearing in 2 weeks. I showed Paul, and he just shook his head. He said he'd tried to tell his mom that Diane wouldn't follow through, that she never did, but Jacqueline had insisted Diane was taking it seriously this time. I called Andre, and he said probation violations were taken seriously by judges, especially when someone made 0 effort to comply. He said I should plan to attend the hearing because the judge might want to hear from me about the original case. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in the same courtroom where Diane had taken her plea deal. Paul came with me, and we sat in the back while the judge handled other cases first. When Diane's case was called, she walked in wearing clothes that looked slept in, her hair messy. Her attorney stood up and tried to explain that Diane had been struggling to find work and couldn't afford the restitution payments. The judge pulled up the case file on his computer and started reading through the probation officer's report out loud. Diane had completed 8 hours of her 200 required community service hours. She'd made 0 restitution payments in 3 months. She'd missed 4 appointments with her probation officer. The judge asked Diane directly if any of this was incorrect, and she just shrugged and mumbled something about how hard it was to find a job with a record. The judge's expression went cold, and he said she'd had 3 months to make some effort. Any effort. And she'd chosen to do nothing. He revoked her probation right there. The judge sentenced Diane to 90 days in county jail for the probation violation, with credit for time served if she completed a work release program. Diane started crying and saying she had kids to take care of, that she couldn't go to jail. The judge said she should have thought about that before ignoring every term of her probation. He told the bailiff to take her into custody, and Diane looked back at Paul with this desperate expression like he was supposed to save her. Paul looked away. 2 officers came forward and put handcuffs on Diane while she cried. They led her through a side door and she was gone. Paul and I sat there for a minute in the empty courtroom. He asked me if I felt bad watching her get taken away, and I told him the truth, that it felt sad but I didn't regret anything. She'd had every chance to follow the rules and she'd chosen not to. That night, Paul's phone exploded with messages from his family. His uncle sent a long text saying this was all my fault, that if I'd just dropped everything from the beginning, Diane would be fine. His aunt called saying I was cruel and heartless for letting the mother of 2 kids go to jail. Even some cousins he barely talked to were messaging him about what a terrible person I was. Paul read through them, getting more and more angry. Finally, he called his uncle back, and I could hear him yelling through the phone. He said Diane made her own choices, that she committed fraud and then violated probation by doing absolutely nothing she was supposed to do. He said they needed to stop blaming me for Diane's decisions. He said he was tired of everyone acting like Diane was the victim when she'd stolen from government programs and squatted in our property. His uncle tried to interrupt, but Paul just kept going. He said if they wanted to be mad at someone, they should be mad at Diane for being a criminal and a terrible mother who kept making selfish choices. He hung up and threw his phone on the couch. He looked at me and said he was done with all of them, that they could either accept reality or leave us alone. I'd never seen him that angry at his own family before, and part of me felt guilty for causing this rift. But mostly I just felt relieved that he finally stood up to them. A few days after Diane got taken away, Paul's phone rang while we were eating dinner. He looked at the screen and mouthed "my mom" before walking into the other room to answer. I could hear his voice through the wall but couldn't make out the words. He came back 20 minutes later looking tired and said his mom wanted to talk to me. I took the phone expecting another lecture about being cruel, but instead she apologized. She said watching Diane get handcuffed made her realize that nothing she'd done over the years had helped her daughter change. She admitted she'd been making excuses for Diane since childhood, and it only made things worse. She asked if we could try to rebuild our relationship separate from all the Diane drama, because she didn't want to lose both her kids over this mess. I told her I'd think about it and we'd talk soon. Paul suggested we invite his mom over for Sunday dinner the next week. I agreed but felt weird about it because the rest of his family still hated me. That first dinner was awkward as hell. We sat at the table making small talk about the weather and Paul's job while avoiding any mention of Diane or the beach house or the legal stuff. His mom kept thanking me for having her over and saying how nice the food was, which made it even more uncomfortable. But by the third Sunday, things got easier. She started telling stories about Paul as a kid, and we actually laughed together. She told me one night that she was glad I'd stood my ground because someone needed to hold Diane accountable. Hearing her say I wasn't the villain meant more than I expected it to. Diane finished her 90 days in county jail and completed the work release program in early fall. Paul's mom mentioned during one of our dinners that Diane had moved 2 hours away to live with some friend from high school. Part of me felt relieved knowing she was gone and wouldn't show up at the beach house or our doorstep. But part of me wondered if jail had actually taught her anything, or if she'd just learned to be more careful next time. I didn't ask for details because honestly I was done caring about what Diane did as long as she stayed away from us. The restitution payment started showing up in my bank account in October. $50 deposited on the 15th of every month, automatically taken from Diane's paychecks through a court order. It wasn't much money and wouldn't cover everything she'd cost us, but seeing that deposit each month felt important. It meant the system was working and she was being held responsible for what she'd done. Paul said it was petty to care about $50 a month, but I told him it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. Our anniversary fell in November, and we decided to spend the weekend at the beach house. We hadn't been there since getting it back except for quick trips to check on repairs. Walking through the door felt strange at first because I kept expecting to see Diane's stuff everywhere, or find some new problem she'd caused. But Tom's crew had done an amazing job cleaning and fixing everything. The walls were repainted, the broken mirror replaced, and it smelled clean instead of like stale cigarettes and old food. We spent Saturday walking on the beach and Sunday morning drinking coffee on the deck. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I could actually relax there. The house felt like ours again instead of a crime scene we had to reclaim. I got a Facebook message request from someone named Marilyn in December. When I opened it, I realized it was Diane's daughter who was 16 now. She wrote a long message apologizing for her mom's behavior and thanking me for not pushing for charges that would have given Diane a longer sentence. She said she knew what her mom did was wrong and she was sorry I got dragged into their family mess. Reading it made my chest tight because this kid had done nothing wrong but was stuck dealing with the consequences of her mom's choices. I wanted to respond and tell her it wasn't her fault, but I didn't because I knew it would just pull me back into Diane's drama. I left the message on read and tried not to think about those kids too much. Tom called me right before Christmas sounding excited about something. He said he'd been getting calls from other property owners asking about his documentation services after word spread about how he'd helped my case. Apparently people had heard through the local real estate network that he'd caught a squatter and built an airtight case with his record keeping. He was hiring another person and expanding that side of his business because of all the new interest. I started laughing because it was so weird that my disaster with Diane had accidentally helped Tom's company grow. He thanked me for being a good client and said he'd give us a discount on management fees for the next year. 6 months after everything started, Paul and I were lying on the beach behind the house watching the sunset. The sand was cold because it was January, but we had blankets and it felt peaceful. Paul rolled over and told me he was proud of how I'd handled the whole situation with his sister. He admitted he'd been worried I would back down when his family started pressuring me, but watching me stand firm made him respect me even more. He said he'd learned something about me during all this, that I was stronger than he'd realized and he was lucky to have married someone who wouldn't let people walk all over her. I didn't know what to say, so I just kissed him and we stayed there until it got too dark to see. We decided we needed to update our estate planning to make sure the beach house stayed protected if anything happened to either of us. Andre helped us set up a trust with really specific terms about how the property could be used and who could access it. He built in protections against anyone claiming squatters' rights or trying to manipulate their way into occupancy. The paperwork was boring and expensive, but it felt good knowing we'd closed that loophole. Andre joked that we were his most paranoid clients, but admitted that after what happened with Diane, the paranoia was justified. Paul's mom mentioned during Sunday dinner in February that Diane was working at some call center and seemed to be staying out of trouble. She said Diane didn't have much choice with probation hanging over her head, and another violation would send her straight back to jail. I nodded and changed the subject because I genuinely didn't care what Diane was doing, as long as she stayed 2 hours away and left us alone. Paul's mom got the message and didn't bring her up again that night. A few weeks later, Paul's uncle sent an email with the subject line, "Apologies." I opened it expecting more drama, but instead found 3 stiff paragraphs admitting he may have overreacted about the Diane situation. He wrote that family matters can get heated, and he hopes we can move past this unpleasantness. I showed it to Paul, who looked surprised his uncle had backed down at all. I replied, keeping it short, saying I accepted the apology but needed him to understand that disrespecting me wasn't something I'd tolerate again. Paul squeezed my shoulder and told me he was proud of how I'd handled it without being petty. The email felt like another small victory, proof that standing firm actually worked. Thanksgiving rolled around and we decided to host at our house instead of going to Jacqueline's like usual. We invited her and a few of Paul's cousins who'd stayed neutral during everything with Diane. 8 people showed up instead of the usual 25, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Nobody was walking on eggshells or pretending everything was fine. Paul's cousin made a joke about how nice it was to have drama-free mashed potatoes, and everyone laughed. Jacqueline brought her famous apple pie and hugged me tight when she arrived, whispering thank you for not shutting her out. We ate and talked about normal things like jobs and upcoming vacations. Paul looked more relaxed than he had in months, joking with his cousins without that tense edge in his voice. After everyone left, we cleaned up together, and he told me this was the best Thanksgiving he'd had in years, because it felt genuine instead of obligatory. The first week of December, a letter arrived from the county with official seals all over it. My stomach dropped thinking it was more legal trouble, but when I opened it, I found a notice that Diane had completed all 200 hours of her community service and was current on her restitution payments. The letter confirmed she was in compliance with all terms of her probation. I read it twice to make sure I understood correctly. Tom had told me most people violated probation at least once, but Diane was actually following through. I filed the letter in the folder with all the other legal documents from this mess. It felt like official closure, confirmation that the system had worked even if it took almost a year from start to finish. Paul came home and I showed him the letter. He seemed relieved but also sad, mentioning he never thought his sister would end up with a criminal record. That weekend we drove to the beach house with paint samples and bathroom fixture catalogs. We'd been talking about renovating the bathroom since it still had the original fixtures from when my grandmother owned the place. The shower was tiny and the tile was cracked in several spots. We spent Saturday measuring everything and looking at different vanity options online. Paul wanted a walk-in shower and I agreed since it would increase the property value. We picked out new tile that looked like weathered wood and found a contractor who could start work in January. It felt good to invest in the place properly instead of just doing basic maintenance to keep it rentable. This was our property and we were treating it like the asset it actually was. We stayed the night and fell asleep making plans for other upgrades we could do over the next few years. Jacqueline came over for dinner the following Tuesday and mentioned something while we were clearing plates. She said Diane had called asking if she could come to Christmas dinner at Jacqueline's house. Jacqueline told her no, that she needed to respect our boundaries and stay away for now. I stopped loading the dishwasher and looked at her. She met my eyes and said she wasn't going to push for forced reconciliation when Diane hadn't even properly apologized for what she'd done. Paul looked shocked that his mom had actually told his sister no. Jacqueline said she loved Diane, but enabling her bad behavior hadn't helped anyone. I hugged her and thanked her for protecting our peace. She patted my back and said she'd learned her lesson about trying to smooth things over when someone needed to face consequences. Christmas Eve came and Paul suggested we drive to the beach house, just the two of us. We packed overnight bags and made the 3-hour drive in comfortable silence with Christmas music playing. The beach was empty and cold when we got there, with gray clouds hanging low over the water. We bundled up in coats and walked along the shore holding hands. Paul brought up how the whole situation with Diane had tested our marriage in ways he never expected. He said watching me stand firm when his entire family was pressuring me to back down made him realize how strong I actually was. I told him I couldn't have done it without knowing he supported me, even when it was hard for him. We talked about how we'd had to choose each other over family pressure, and how that choice had made our relationship stronger. The wind picked up and we headed back to the house, spending the evening watching old movies and eating takeout Chinese food. Somewhere between Christmas and New Year's, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't angry at Diane anymore. The rage that had burned hot for months had cooled into complete indifference. She wasn't part of my life, and that was fine. The beach house was secure with new locks and Tom's management system running smoothly. The legal issues were resolved with her criminal record and ongoing restitution. I didn't waste energy thinking about her or wondering what she was doing. She'd become irrelevant to my daily life. Paul noticed the change and commented that I seemed lighter, less tense. I told him I'd stopped caring what Diane thought or did, and he said that was probably the healthiest place I could be. We invited Jacqueline to spend New Year's at the beach house with us. She arrived on the 30th with a bag full of photo albums she'd brought to show us. That night, we sat around looking at pictures of Paul and Diane as kids. Jacqueline told stories about their childhood, how Diane had always been the difficult one who pushed boundaries and expected special treatment. She admitted she'd hoped Diane would grow out of it as she got older, that maturity would smooth out those rough edges. Instead, Diane had just gotten better at manipulating people and avoiding consequences. Jacqueline's voice got quiet when she said she was sad it took criminal charges and a fraud conviction for Diane to finally face reality. Paul held his mom's hand and told her it wasn't her fault. She wiped her eyes and said she knew that now, but it had taken her a long time to stop blaming herself for how Diane turned out. January brought new renters, a couple in their 50s who Tom had vetted carefully. They stayed for 2 weeks and Tom did a walkthrough after they left. He called me sounding pleased and said they'd left the place spotless with a thank you note on the kitchen counter. The note thanked us for sharing our beautiful home and mentioned how peaceful their stay had been. Tom's management system was working perfectly, with regular inspections and careful tenant screening. The rental income was covering all the property expenses plus building up our savings account. Paul and I talked about maybe using that money for a real vacation next year, somewhere we'd always wanted to go. The beach house had gone from being a source of stress and conflict to actually generating income and giving us options. Paul's phone buzzed during dinner on a Wednesday in mid-January. He glanced at it and his expression changed. He showed me the screen where a text from Diane asked if they could meet for coffee. Just those words, nothing else. Paul looked at me and asked what I thought he should do. I took a breath and told him it was completely his decision, but I wasn't interested in any relationship with her. I said he needed to protect our boundaries and not let her manipulate her way back into our lives. If he wanted to meet her, that was fine, but I wouldn't be there and I expected him to be careful. He nodded slowly and said he'd think about it before responding. The text sat unanswered on his phone while we finished eating. Paul texted Diane back the next morning saying he'd meet her for coffee that Saturday. I watched him type and retype the message 3 times before finally sending it, and I could see the worry on his face about what she might want. Saturday came and he left around 10 in the morning, telling me he'd be back in an hour or 2 depending on how it went. I spent that time cleaning the house and trying not to think about what they were talking about. He came home just after noon looking thoughtful but not upset. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me Diane seemed different, quieter and less defensive than he'd ever seen her. She'd apologized for everything she put us through and admitted she'd been completely wrong about the beach house situation. Paul said she talked about her therapy sessions and how she was working on taking responsibility for her choices instead of blaming other people. He seemed cautiously hopeful that maybe she was actually changing, but he agreed immediately when I said we needed to keep our distance regardless. I told him I was glad he got some closure from seeing her, but I was done with her drama and didn't want any relationship with her going forward. He nodded and said he understood completely, and we left it at that. A few weeks later, we realized it had been exactly 1 year since we got the beach house back from Diane's illegal occupation. Paul suggested we celebrate by having a small party there with close friends. Nothing fancy, but just marking the fact that we'd survived everything and come out okay. We invited maybe 10 people, mostly our closest friends who'd supported us through the whole mess. Everyone brought food and drinks, and we spent the afternoon on the deck eating and laughing. Someone made a joke about my squatter saga, and everyone started sharing their favorite parts of the story, like when Diane tried to claim tenant rights, or when she got arrested for welfare fraud. I found myself laughing along with them, and it hit me that the whole thing had become just a story now, not an open wound that hurt every time I thought about it. The beach house felt completely ours again, just a place where we made good memories with people we cared about. Later that evening, after everyone left, Jacqueline pulled me aside while Paul was cleaning up inside. She told me she wanted to say something she'd been thinking about for months. She said she was grateful I'd stood firm against Diane because her daughter had needed to hit rock bottom to have any real chance of changing. Jacqueline admitted she'd enabled Diane's behavior for years by always bailing her out and making excuses, and watching me refuse to do that had been hard but necessary. She looked at me and said she was proud to have me as a daughter-in-law, which caught me completely off guard. I'd expected her to always resent me a little for what happened with Diane, but instead she seemed genuinely grateful. We hugged and I felt something shift between us, like we'd moved past all the tension and found actual respect for each other. Paul and I sat on the deck after Jacqueline went to bed, watching the sunset turn the ocean orange and pink. He reached over and took my hand, saying this place represented everything good about us. We'd fought for what was ours, hadn't let anyone push us around and come out stronger together on the other side. I squeezed his hand and told him I couldn't agree more. For the first time in months, everything felt completely right, like we'd finally moved past the chaos and found our way back to peace. The beach house sat quiet around us, just a simple 2-bedroom place by the ocean, but it meant so much more now than it had before all this started.